Hello, and welcome to the Allegheny Arts Council's Art on Demand. My name is Bobby Croft, and I am a local artist and art educator that will lead you through today's lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to learn how to create our very own snowflake artwork. This lesson is broken into two videos. The first video will show you how to use different watercolor techniques to create a background, and in the second video, you're going to learn how to use collage techniques to create your snowflakes. For the first part of your project, you're going to need white paper, preferably a thicker paper, maybe a watercolor paper or a nice drawing paper. You want to avoid any copy paper or printer paper, as that is too thin to paint on. You're going to need watercolor paint. We are going to be making a wash out of watercolor. So if you have watercolor paint at home, I like the liquid watercolor in a tube. You could also use the watercolor from a tray to create your wash. Or if you don't have watercolor at home, you can use an old water-based marker by taking the cap of your marker off and putting the end of your marker into the water, into a cup of water. The water will absorb into the marker and bring the ink out, creating a watercolor wash for your project. Because we're creating a starry, snowy night scene, I'm using indigo, but you could use blue, purple, or whatever color you choose. And then depending on what techniques from this video you want to try, you'll need a white crayon, plastic wrap from your kitchen, regular table salt, and or cooking spray. I'm using olive oil, but you could use vegetable oil as well. The first watercolor technique I'm going to show you is a wax resist using a white crayon on paper. So, crayons are made out of wax, and wax will resist or block water. So, by using a white crayon, a wax crayon, we can draw on our paper whatever we want. So, once again, we're creating a snowy scene with stars or other things in the distance. So, I'm going to create some stars. I'm going to create some snowflakes using my white crayon. Okay. Once I have whatever I want drawn onto my paper, I'm going to take my watercolor mixture. Remember, this is just watercolor thinned out or marker thinned out in water to create a wash. It's very liquidy. It's very, very thin paint. I'm going to take this wash and I'm going to paint directly over my crayon. And you can see where I use the crayon, the wax crayon is resisting the watercolor paint. What I'll do at this point is sit this off to the side and allow it to dry before I move on to the next step. The second watercolor technique I'm going to show you is using table salt to create a beautiful texture in your watercolor. So the first thing you're going to do is take your watercolor mixture and you're going to paint a thin coat on your paper. Avoid having large pools of watercolor on your paper. When you use this technique, you want to have a fairly thin coat or cover on your watercolor paper. So now that I have a fairly thin coat there, I'm going to take table salt. I'm going to put a little bit in my hand. You don't want a lot for this technique. What you're going to do is take and sprinkle salt, not a lot. This is a technique where little will do a lot for you. you're going to add a little bit of salt on top of your watercolor. And what the salt will do is absorb the watercolor, creating a speckling design that you will see in your final design. Once again, you'll set this off to the side and allow it to dry before you move on to your next step. The third watercolor technique I wanted to show you was using plastic wrap or cling wrap from your kitchen to create a design or texture on your paper. So to start with, you're going to paint a watercolor wash on your paper. Once again, try to avoid having any large puddles of watercolor paint kind of pulled up on your paper. Then what you're going to do, taking the plastic wrap, you're going to cut a piece bigger than your piece of paper. And I know it's hard to see, but you're going to very lightly, very little, crinkle up your plastic wrap so it's not completely flat. And then lay it on top of your watercolor paint or paper, and you're going to press down. And you're going to see where the watercolor is pulling into the creases of the cling wrap or the plastic wrap. And you can see that it's creating a texture or a pattern with our watercolor. Once again, you're going to let this sit and dry before you move on to your next step. The final watercolor technique I wanted to show you was using a vegetable oil spray to create your design. So if you choose to do this option or this technique, you're going to take a spray vegetable oil. So it could be olive oil or vegetable oil, either will work. And you're going to spray a thin coat onto your paper. Now I've already done this because it is key that you allow your vegetable oil some time to dry. Okay, so if you choose to do this option, you're not going to put a lot of vegetable oil onto your paper. Little is a lot. A little will go a long way. Okay, so now that I've let the vegetable oil or the olive oil dry on my paper, I'm going to take my watercolor mixture and I'm going to paint a coat of that right over the olive oil. And you can see that it is resisting very much, resisting the watercolor very much like the crayon did. Oil and water don't mix. So it is natural that our watercolor is being resisted by the olive oil or the cooking spray. Once again, you'll allow this to dry before you move on to your next step. And there you have 4 different watercolor techniques that you can try today. Play around with these different techniques and experiment to come up with something that you are going to really be proud of for your snowflake artwork. Maybe you'll experiment and come up with your own technique, or maybe you'll layer some of these techniques to create the background of your artwork. And in fact, that is what I have done for mine. I've taken 2 of the techniques and I've combined them, the salt and the plastic wrap technique. And this is going to be the base for the artwork that I'm going to complete in video number 2. Now, as I've said a number of times in this video, you want to allow your project or your paper enough time to dry. So sit these somewhere that they'll be safe for a while and allow them to dry, even overnight, to make sure that the paper is fully dry before you move on to step number 2, which is highlighted in our second video for this month.